So an update here on the Kyosho Lazer ZX-S Evolution runner build with the 3D printed parts and some of the reproduced carbon parts. As you can see, the roller is essentially done. There's one or two minor tweaks I need to make, but I'm going to show you what I did since last time when I basically had just the center part of the chassis done. We'll start simple here with the battery straps. So I got these straps made by the same person that did these front and rear towers and some of the rear gearbox plates. You can get even 3D printed versions of these from someone in the UK. I can't remember who, but there are different ways to get straps. Nonetheless, what I decided to do here, instead of using the plastic posts for the Kyosho Lazer, which are a bit fatter, and then I would have to actually cut those to make room for a lipo saddle, is to use standoff posts here. So these are the same 20mm standoffs that I have here in the gearbox, and I just put under that a 4mm spacer, so that way this plate is elevated a bit, so when you put the battery in, it actually sits in there and doesn't have a chance to pop out. And then these little screws here, these thumb screws, hold it down. This particular height is good enough for a full-sized lipo saddle pack. If you want to use one of the smaller capacity packs, like a 3200 milliamp hour pack, then you can put some foam spacers under this battery holder to pick up the slack. Okay, but this is the appropriate height here. Now going to the rear suspension, what did I do here? So front and rear, by the way, I decided to install big bore shocks. I just pulled these off of one of my spare Kyosho RB6s. I did this because I'm just more familiar with tuning on these big bore shocks. Normally you would use something like equalizer shocks or twin cap shocks, or even the first gen velvet shocks for like the RB5, which are standard bore. But the pistons for those are a different style, and I have maybe one or two cars that have those with a setup. But I'm just more familiar about setting up with big bores, and I think the big bores look kind of neat on this ZX-S style chassis anyway. But no matter, to make these fit, it's actually a good thing that when I got the towers reproduced, that I had an extra row of mounting holes on the bottom here, because these newer shocks are a little shorter. You could use longer shock ends to pick up that difference in height. But with, I think this shock end here is that's already a long shock end. And on the front, that is, I think it's a short or medium. Yeah, that's a short shock end right there. So certainly on the rear, you would either have to accept lower droop or have to use, a lower mounting hole or something like that if you want to use big bores. So what did I do for the actual arms and drivetrain here? So the rear dog bones are 62.5mm long. I do not have any axle spacers on the inside or outside of the hub carriers. These are the ZX-S style hub carriers, which would be the same as what you might see on a ZX5 or an RB5, very, very similar geometry. Now the thing is, between the ZX-S and the ZX-S Evo, for the rear hub carriers, they went from using the older laser style hub carriers to the more modern style hub carriers that you see in their modern cars. You could use either, but if you're using these 62.5mm dog bone, the wheel axle itself, I do not recall the part number, but just to help illustrate for you, Kyosho makes several wheel axles, and they have these little, sorry, let me see if I can get it to zoom here correctly or to focus. These little metal bands in here. You see this one has two black bands in it, and this gives you an indication of how wide the wheel axle is. This wheel axle doesn't have any of these bands, so whatever that part number is, I have that on either side, so there are no spacers on either side. This is just the standard Kyosho wheel hex, so this will give you essentially the minimum width on the rear. I'm going to start here and see where that goes, because on my ZX-RR I run modern Kyosho wheels, and which have a different offset, and I also want to make the car a bit wider, so I run a very wide wheel hex on the ZX-RR. Here what I want to try to do is run the standard sort of width, if you will, for the drivetrain, and to run ZX-S or ZX5 style rims, which have a different offset. And if anything, if I need to move this around, you know, I could either experiment with different wheel hexes, which I have, or I can use different wheels with a different offset. So for example, the JC Racing wheels, I think those, the 5-spoke rims for the Lazer, those push the width out a bit more. So, you know, I might use those instead, we'll see. But I'm going to start with this, okay? In order to get this 62.5 millimeter dog bone to sort of fit without sliding out of the diff out drives, you have to remember that these, whether it's you use a ball diff or a gear diff, these drive cups, they attach onto the output shafts. Sorry, this is specific to the gear diff. They attach onto the output shaft here, and you can adjust where these are. So if I loosen this grub screw, I can move this drive cup in or out. So you have to make sure it's out far enough to capture the end of the dog bone, but not so far out that the grub screw doesn't actually catch onto the end of the output shaft from the differential. So it's, you know, there's plenty of room to do that, and this is set up such that there's no shaft from the output shaft protruding into the drive cup. Okay, so this is kind of, you could say, all the way out. If you want to be a little cleaner about it, you can take, you know, put a little spacer or something between the bearing here and this drive cup. Right now I'm just leaving that open. I don't think that'll be too big a deal. This is what I have here, and then in order to fit the hinge pins on, because you got to remember this inner hinge pin brace is a 3D printed part, you do have to get a 3mm drill bit and just kind of hand drill out that hole to make it a nice smooth fit for the hinge pin. And then also for this plate here, this is a reproduced plate, and so the hole size here wasn't quite the right size, so I had to bore that out a little bit so I can fit the hinge pin through. Otherwise it seems to fit okay. Okay, so that's for the rear. And then for the front, what I did, you know, same thing with the drive cups here for the front ball diff. You got to pull those out. But for the actual drive shaft, this is a 65.5 millimeter drive shaft with a 2mm axle spacer on the inside here. Okay, and this wheel axle is the 2-bar type, whatever that part number is. So it's this part here. So that gives you, it adds a bit of width, so I could put the axle spacer on the inside, in this case, to push this dog bone in a bit more. So this effectively gives you a 67.5 millimeter length. So if you went to the 0-bar wheel axle, you would need a 67.5 millimeter dog bone to accommodate that. This is because the front doesn't have quite as much droop as the rear, so if you want to get more droop, you have to push the dog bone in a bit more so that the outdrive can actually capture the dog bone. Okay. Let's see, for the shocks, same thing with the shocks. I have to use the bottom row here for the modern big bore shocks. Although again, if I use a longer shock end, I could probably get even more droop or move this to the top hole, either way. As far as how the hub carrier and caster block are set up, as you can see, this is the LA59 part, which is the ZXRR hub carrier. So this is what you would see on the ZX-S. The ZX-S Evo has a different caster block, and I went over that on one of my Inferno 10 tuning videos recently. You can go take a look at that. So I decided to use this because I frankly have a few more of these, so I'm just going to use them. Now to set up the actual kingpins, this is where it can get a little tricky. I didn't want to use the original Kyosho kingpins because I just don't want to lose those parts. And the ball stud kingpin that comes with the ZX-S and the ZX-S Evo is specific to that model, I believe, which has a sort of a tall shoulder component to it that raises the ball stud up. And that's because if you use a ball cup here, when you compress the suspension, you don't want that hitting the caster block. If I take this ball stud and I lower it, I won't be able to get as much compression before this ball cup hits the caster block, and I'll have less total suspension travel. So that's why they originally made that part to be taller. Now you can replicate the same thing by using, in this case I have a 3 racing 10 millimeter long ball stud here. As you can see, it's a little loose. I have to tighten it a bit. With a, this is a 2 millimeter spacer, and then this little hat bushing here is from the ZX-5 steering assembly, which comes with some hat bushings. So again, I forget the part number, but there are several Kyosho part numbers. It could either be the ZX-5 steering assembly or some stuff for, I think, the spiders. They come with these little hat bushings, so I use one up here and also on the bottom, just with a screw, and that's a way to emulate the effect of a Kingpin. The only thing is when you use these, actually even if you use a Kingpin, you have to be careful about how you tighten these down. If you crank them down, you won't be able to actually steer the car. So you have to loosen them a little bit. But if you do so, these can come too loose, as you see here, and then you won't actually get very, consistent behavior. So what you have to do actually is, once you're confident with how this is set up, at least what I'm going to do is put some blue thread lock, not red, no, some blue thread lock on the threads for this screw here and on the bottom one, and screw it in, and that'll help it to sort of semi-lock in place for actual running. So I'm going to do that later. Right now I just put this in for fitment, just to make sure it works okay. So for the steering assembly, the last time you guys saw this, I believe this was a bit lower down. I think maybe this horn was on the bottom, but what was happening there was that when you turn the belt crank, the horn ends up colliding with the bottom of the belt here. So you have to rearrange this so that this whole thing gets pushed up a bit, primarily this horn piece, so it moves to the top. And then I think to accommodate that, I may have had to change, I don't quite remember, the position of the drag link, whether it was above or below, these arms here. So right now these are underneath, the drag length is mounted underneath these arms, just to get the appropriate height. So again, this doesn't collide with the belt or anything else. And then as far as the ball stud, so this is a 3 racing, I think these are 4.8 millimeter ball studs. These come with a standard offset between the threading and the ball stud, which pushes them a little bit out. But that's what I'm using here. This is their 6 millimeter thread length ball stud. And then over here, I'm just using a standard Kyosho short ball stud. Or you could use one of these too if you want. But this short one doesn't have any offset here between the ball stud and the threading. So as is, when you set it up like that, you get a little bit of bump steer. So I might have to tune that out. Okay. So again, some tweaking will be necessary. Other things of note, the way I did the upper arm assembly, I do have 3D printed upper arms for the ZX-S and ZX-S Evo. I decided not to use those because for a few reasons. If you were going to use the top mounting holes here for the inner camber link, which is those are the default holes, you would probably be okay using those upper arms. I want to use the bottom holes because I want to raise the roll center, because the kind of dirt tracks that I have around me that I could race on are higher grip, and so I'm going to need a higher roll center. That means I have to drop the inner camber link. If I do that and I mount the upper arm on that, it's possible that it could interfere with the diff out drive. So I decided to instead basically use a turnbuckle and just mount that to this rear plate here, for which the holes are aligned to the front tower. So I'm not actually using the camber link holes on the front tower. I'm just using this rear plate with a turnbuckle. Also makes it a little bit easier to adjust because with those upper arms, you have to use a very small turnbuckle to connect the upper arm to a ball stud, and you don't get quite as much range for tuning there. Or it's a little bit harder to tune it. So I figured just a turnbuckle will be easier anyway. These here, what I have here is just a Traxxas ball end, because that allows me to thread a screw through it and then put a lock nut on this side, and that's all set. What else do I want to mention? I think the only thing else I wanted to mention was with I need to put some kind of a roller in here somewhere to push this down ever so slightly. Because if I do that, right now if I don't do that, the top of this belt, the spine of the belt is going to drag a little bit on the bottom of this inner plate here. They do touch, and so that will wear down the belt prematurely. So if I can, you know, set up some kind of a roller here to just push this down a little bit, I'll make a gap here, and that will alleviate some of the drivetrain bind that's coming from this contact here between the belt and this plate. So that's one of the next things I have to do. I did something very similar to that on my ZX-RR. Again, you can go back and take a look at the video I have on that. Other than that, it's kind of ready to have the electronics installed and to start, you know, painting and mounting the body, doing some tuning, that kind of stuff. So this is it. It does look like the 3D printed parts did okay with building a replica ZX-S/ZX-S Evo. If I were to do this again, I would get Fiberlight parts for the repro parts for like the gearbox, the rear gearbox, and the chassis and the upper deck and everything. Again, this upper deck and this chassis are the original Kyosho parts. All the other carbon parts are reproduction, but the reproduction was it was a little messed up on some of the parts. I think, if I remember correctly, some of the rear gearbox pieces where it mounts to the lower half, I had to adjust that a bit. The front and rear plates here for the hinge pins, I had to adjust those a bit. The towers are fine. Those are perfect. But everything else needed some tweaking. So if you go to Fiberlight, those parts are a perfect fit. There's no problem. The only thing is, Fiberlight doesn't make modified towers with different holes. So I might get in touch with them to see if they're willing to do that, or if one of you guys want to do that, that's fine. But I'm happy with these towers. These are very nice. These make this car, give it a lot more adjustability. That's it, at least for now. So thanks for watching.